Start recording. All right. First of all, thank you all for joining us this morning going into the afternoon. So we're here to talk about inequities within planning and what we can do. So just a quick introduction of who I am. My name is Matt Hershinger. My role is the assistant to the city manager for the city of Arvada. And one of the hats that I wear is to lead our own diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, among a few other things. We don't have a specialist right now in our city, and so I've taken the lead on it. And I've been taking a number of coursework trainings and other things just to get as much up to speed as I can. And this presentation is really a culmination of the best lessons and practices I've picked up about planning in particular, and to kind of share the wealth. Would you introduce yourself, Jen?
Yeah, my name is Jennifer Woods. I am AICP certified. Right now I'm acting interim town manager for the town of Hudson, and I'm also their planning director. But for those of us planners out there, I don't have to describe to you what I do. I do everything right now, and finance, which is fun. So I'm also the co-chair on the APA Colorado Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, and I'm a proud member of the Chickasaw Nation. I am very, very happy to be here. Matt's done a great job with this, and we'll get into it. Thank you.
Right. So just to set expectations for what we're going to go through today. We're going to start with some current perceptions among Colorado planners. Jen will talk about the survey that you all recently took, some of the results and findings from that. After that, we're going to define equity and progress for our purposes today. You know, these are loose terms with competing and valid definitions. So just kind of get a baseline understanding so we know we're talking about the same thing. We're going to go into realities of our current situation. This is going to be done primarily through case law for two reasons. One is because during my research, that's primarily what I did for it. And also case law tends to be good just because it's factual, it's well documented, and it tends to be a less controversial source of information when we look at history, or at least less controversial in the sense that people won't debate with you whether it was true or not. After that, we're going to do a simplified walkthrough of how to move the needle. Obviously, we're not going to move mountains in just a bit over an hour, but we're going to give you some steps to take. What I will ask, obviously there's dozens of us and this is remote, which does limit our ability to be interactive. But as we go through some steps, we'll ask you to think of one topic, one aspect of your work you would like to start brainstorming, to think about ways that you could change or improve it when it comes time to. And then we'll wrap up with a spur to action, because that's kind of what this is all about.
All right, so we'll talk a little about the survey results. Many of you may have participated in the survey that was conducted in 2021. The Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion group here at APA Colorado had a big hand in that, and had some faculty support from CU, and has really translated itself into a bigger report. And I'll give you a few of the highlights of that, although they may not be surprising, but I will try and say them with as much gusto as they need. So the survey primarily focused on the perception of bias and the state of equity, diversity, inclusion in our profession. We were very introspective in the survey. It reported higher rates of females and people of color not feeling like they actually belong in their workplace or work environments, seeing others being given unfair compensation or raises, and reporting, just straight up reporting bias in their workplace, that there is obvious bias in their workplace. And when I say perceived, I mean, we're asking people survey questions about their experiences. But the biggest perception that came out of this survey was, and the word cloud really kind of speaks to it, is it starts at the highest levels of leadership. And the changes are going to start at the highest levels of leadership. And the tools that we need to instigate those changes are not there. They don't exist right now. And we're all kind of grasping at straws to see what everybody else is doing to make themselves more equitable, more diverse, and more inclusive. And it all came down to leadership, and toolkits and tools and studies, success stories. I mean, us planners, we we live our lives surrounding case studies sometimes to try and help us build a map, a road network of where we want to go, where we can go. We really need to be doing that for this particular issue. And I say the word perceive, but I want to kind of end my little diatribe by saying, when this many people perceive the same issues, it's really probably not a perception. It is very much a reality. So the data really speaks to that. So we have pushed the survey through the board. I know the board is working on some things to try and accept that and get that pushed out. So we hope to have that available to everybody, but we can definitely make it available on request if you'd like the executive summary or the larger survey as well. And I can send you those. But that'll be just kind of rounding up in a very, very high level summary what the survey concluded. Back to you, Matt.
All right, thanks, Jen. And so as we move forward with this conversation, once again, let's just get a common understanding of what we're talking about with equity. So I'll go ahead and read this quote on it. It's one of my favorites of numerous ones I've come across, which says, social equity has evolved from a philosophical issue concerned with the social contract to a structural issue concerned with real impacts on real people's lives. In today's parlance, it is an activist notion that requires government to be a lever for change. There's a few reasons I like this definition that I'll break down. First of all, one of the authors of the book that this came from, Mary Guy, is a professor for CU Denver's public administration program. So there's a Colorado connection there. There's a local government connection. I also like it because these terms do change and shift over time. It is not a fault of it. It's just a natural progression as the conversations change, as which types of groups we focus on shift with the needs of the moment. And so it is a little bit of a moving target, but that's fine. Currently, equity really is talking about structures. Usually when you see acronyms like DEI or DBIE or whatever it is, it's belonging, inclusiveness. Those things are the ones that tend to deal with how we treat people, about respect and dignity. Currently, the most common use of equity is for things like structures, policies, processes, things that don't really necessarily have to do with how we treat people on a human level, but the rules we have in place and how those affect them. And that's kind of what we're focusing on for today's training. And then, of course, the requiring the government to be a lever of change. This isn't anything new. There have been asks for more rights, more respect, less barriers throughout our entire history. But there has been a growth recently from the public asking us specifically to do something. And so that part is new and where I think this definition fits. Progress is kind of the other one I want to hit on, just so that we kind of have a same understanding when we start to brainstorm ideas of what we can do. A lot of people think about progress from the past and kind of how we have done better. A typical example is we used to have slavery. Now we don't, therefore we've progressed. We used to have redlining, now we don't. Progress. Another way to look at progress is by an unrealized future. For example, there's still the gender pay gap in most industries, therefore we haven't progressed. There are still many demographic groups who are, say, imprisoned, even when you account for other variables like types of crimes committed, socioeconomic status and stuff, therefore we haven't progressed. This is where the debate ends up being people talking over each other, because we're looking at the same situation just from different angles of what we've done compared to what we haven't. For today, I'm going to ask you to lean a little bit more into that latter one, to more think about the things we haven't been able to do yet, because that just helps spur us to action a little bit quicker. Both definitions are valid, but just for our purposes today. All right, so talking about some case law. This first page is just really getting into some of the essentials, some of the big cases. They'll probably be familiar to many people. Quick shout out to the picture on the right, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. If you haven't read it, please do. It is a really good book. I think it came out 2017, 2018. So it's current, it's relevant, it'll help. But getting into the court cases, and just so that we kind of understand where we've been, Scott v. Sanford, commonly known as the Dred Scott case. This was essentially whether a Black man in 1857 had the right to be a citizen. He had been recognized by one of the states, but the question before the Supreme Court was if he was a US citizen. And I've got my cheat sheet with quotes here. And where the Supreme Court said they are not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States. It's one of our most infamous cases, and to understand that almost 100 years after our country's founding, we did tell people that you are not citizens. The Constitution is not about all men are, created equal and all that good stuff. And it took the Civil War to change that, which brings us to our second infamous case, Plessy v. Ferguson. For those unfamiliar, this is the case that is most known for legitimizing separate but equal, which huge effect on planning, separate neighborhoods, separate schools, separate services, under the guise of separate but equal. My favorite quote that I like to use for this one was the object of the 14th Amendment, one of the ones that had come out of the Civil War, was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law. But in the nature of things, it could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based upon color or to enforce social, as distinguished from political equality, or a commingling of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory to either. Where once again, we decided that, okay, we're politically equal, which, was questionable if that was true, but at least we said we were. But we said outright, socially, we don't have to be the same, and we shouldn't. Oftentimes, people ask questions like, what is social justice about? And why is it social economy and social this and social that? And this is a good resource because we talk about the social, because we have historically talked about it in ways that intentionally did have separate classes of citizens. Our next biggest case, once again, probably familiar to most people, Brown v. Board of Education. This one celebrated. This is seen often as the end of Jim Crow laws, and to a degree it was. Brown v. Board of Education was about public schools, and the Supreme Court did rule that it was not constitutional to have racially separated public schools. The thing to keep in mind, though, just to temper how much of a success that was, is we don't usually talk about Brown v. Board of Education 2. A year later, the Supreme Court came out with another decision to tell people, no, we really meant it for Brown v. Board of Education. A lot of school districts and states just outright refused. It wasn't like they said, okay, it's fine now, we were wrong. People dug their heels in. And so there had to be a lot of pushing and prodding to keep that happening. And as I said, this was for schools. And it really wasn't until the 1970s that these laws were effectively ended across the board. At the same time that government austerity became a big thing. And so just as a lot of services, a lot of opportunities became equal for a lot of people, those opportunities diminished because the services decreased. But that was in the past. That's a look back at history, and a lot of people will always claim that, well, that was then, this is now. So a couple of cases a bit more recently. State v. Lobato is actually a Colorado Supreme Court case, happening within our state, where a group had challenged how our public school system is funded. And actually a lower court had ruled that we needed to change. The Supreme Court reversed it and upheld things. And once again, I do like to use the quotes here. While we sympathize with the plaintiffs and recognize that the public school financing system might not provide an optimal amount of money to the public schools, the statutory public school financing system itself is constitutional, which essentially meant that our justices admitted that, hey, the way we finance our school system, which is, based on property tax, it probably isn't fair. And people probably are getting very different educations in our public school system. But if it's law, so we're going to accept it. As far as I'm aware, we have not had any massive reforms since 2013. So there's one, glaring issue we're aware of, that our kids are not necessarily getting anywhere close to a fair or equal education. Adam Community Center, v. City of Troy, 2019. Thankfully for us, this isn't Colorado. This one is the City of Troy, Michigan, where this case stands out, partly because it's recent, but a group had wanted to establish the first mosque in a mid-sized city. I think it was about 100,000 people. And they had kept running into barriers. At their first attempt, they had been delayed until someone else brought the property in question. Another time, the information was leaked and a group outbid them. They finally found the best property they could. Then they asked for a variance, which, honestly, should have asked for the variance first, but then they got denied. And allegedly during their zoning board hearing, their city attorney had said not to follow RLUIPA, which I wrote the acronym out here, Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, to just ignore it. Once again, we're talking 2019. This is a case that fortunately went for the Adam Community Center. They were eventually able to get their mosque, but understand that it took them years to establish a legitimate place of worship. So it's something we don't like to think about or talk about. That once again, we like to think these kind of shenanigans happened in the past, but it still does. And on top of this, and work with me here, we're going to get to solutions soon, but this first part, as we talk about the inequities, will be a bit of a downer. But we do have some restraints on what we can do. Because as much as we want to, right every injustice and just, barrel forward, we have to be mindful of the ways we can get tripped up. One effort was done in Seattle School District number 1 in 2007, and their solution was to try to make all their schools racially proportional. They had a number of schools in the Seattle area. They had developed a busing system to really try to even out their schools. And of course, they were eventually challenged. This one made it to the US Supreme Court. And it was ruled that they can't do that. They can't make those decisions based on race, even if it is trying to make it more balanced. Last line of that case was the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. My personal opinion, not the most forward-thinking decision, but that's currently the law of the land, to where historically we, very intentionally made decisions against certain groups of people. And now our hands are tied that we can't necessarily purposefully give benefits to them. Or even try to intentionally make it more, fair in this case. Another one that's kind of worth mentioning is the Texas Department of Housing, Community Affairs, via Inclusive Community Projects, is that this one also went to the Supreme Court, but it was a narrow thing they had to decide on, where could they use disparate impact studies as evidence, with a disparate impact study being basically trying to measure different kind of development projects and how it might affect different populations differently, whether by location, by socioeconomic status, by race, age, so on and so forth. It did rule in favor of inclusive community projects that, yes, you can actually use this kind of information as evidence. So tentatively, that is something we could potentially use, but unfortunately, when it went back down to the lower court with the instructions that yes, it can be used, the end up decision did still go to the Department of Housing. That it still wasn't enough to get a favorable ruling, and that decision was 5-4 under the 2015 Supreme Court, which has changed. And the dissent for that, honestly, if you want some dramatic reading, it was very strong. The people who were against this kind of study being done, didn't filter their words for it. Colorado Revised Statutes 3123-310. Just reading it straight out. This part 3 shall not be construed in the case of any municipality to confer or enlarge any authority or power to establish any restriction based upon race or color. Once again, it does help, and it helps mitigate, at least explicit forms of intolerance against people. But the catch is it also makes it very tricky to also help intentionally where we can. And one case that actually I'm happy that Jen brought to my attention, it's ongoing, hasn't been a decision made, is this last one, Students for Fair Admissions versus President's Fellows of Harvard. It's an interesting case where groups are challenging Harvard based on how they select based on race and how it's actually creating problems for Asian students who, have had a greater number and now are getting turned down. So it's a complicated issue. It is ongoing. And yeah, in this matter, in many ways, we do have one hand tied behind our back, which is important to be aware of. And the last slide for our first part, and before we start to shift to solutions, is kind of looking at where we're at. Being aware that planning has the technical savvy, has the expertise, and where does that position us, or in this case you, because I'm not a planner, in our current situation. So first, I do want to stress and make sure everyone here understands is the influence you do have. You are the experts. You are the ones who do know your codes, your ordinances, who just know the fundamentals and beyond the fundamentals of planning. And that is a power in this discussion. You do have, to varying degrees, authority. You have resources. I realize that, everyone's busy these days, especially with getting out of the pandemic, the turnover and all that stuff. But the fact that we still work our day-to-day jobs directly in planning is still a resource. We have our organization, which is something most people don't have. With that comes oftentimes the low bar set before us. One example, another case law one, is that anytime we do like a takings of a property, really what has been established is all we have to do is have a rational nexus, which basically means any property we're taking has to be connected to what we're trying to do reasonably. We can't just make up a reason, and scientific evidence. We need some sort of metric, something solid to stand on. And honestly, for this group of people, I think you can usually put that together. So on top of having expertise, oftentimes there's a low bar of what we need to actually put forward in order to get things accomplished, whether it's for the public good or whether it actually harms people in the community. And then there's the enigma or the kind of contradiction with the community. That oftentimes, and this happens across all departments and functions in local government, is we fall prey to elitism. You know, we're the ones with the education, we have the expertise, we know the ins and outs, which does push us oftentimes to skip community outreach for those who are most effective, especially because often those who we need to hear from the most are the least likely to speak up, who aren't connected to our systems, who are processes, who aren't even aware of them. And so often with the way we do things, we can end up skipping over them. On the flip side, oftentimes we get the community involvement when we definitely don't want it. And, you know, the NIMBYs and basically the community jumps in to say, no, we don't want these kind of people coming into our community. You know, you can fill in the blank with what they mean by these people or this kind of development, because then it'll bring in these kind of people in a way that is implicitly or even explicitly discriminatory. And so as the experts, it's a matter of trying to navigate those requests. So, you know, we get the community involvement when it's not the most helpful, and we don't get it when we really do need it, you know, which adds on to the challenges. So, yeah, so at this point, kind of a refresher, you know, historically, we've definitely had problems. Unfortunately, currently, there are still cases that really shine a not favorable light to our local governments, to planning as an institution. We do have constraints on what we can do. And as the technical experts, we do have some tricky situations. So it's tough. You know, I wish I could have given this first part of the presentation to say, no, this is all easy, we got this. But if it was, then we probably wouldn't be talking about this. So let's get into the solutions. As I said, start getting your topic in mind. I encourage people to write something or type it or whatever works for you as we go along. But our first step is to do no harm. So I realize this is people's lunch break, so people might be eating, perfectly valid. But I do want to get people's attention for this part because it's important, and I'm going to read this to everybody and really emphasize it and break it down. If we're interested in working in equity, if we do want to move the needle, make a difference, however we want to call it, it is necessary to understand that our roles as public servants are not inherently benevolent, that we do have a very real potential to cause harm, and that our structures and systems are not foolproof. To believe this is to accept a level of accountability that is unfortunately optional for most of us. Okay. We often, and this has happened to me, and this has happened to people across government services on all levels, is we're fed a narrative that as public servants, because we get, most of us probably here get paid through taxpayer dollars, we might get paid a little bit less than if we worked for the private sector. That means that, oh, we're good. We are serving the public. We're doing the right thing. It can, and it should. And I would say most of us, most of the time, are probably doing it right. But it is not inherent. You know, we've seen the cases historically. We've seen the cases recently where people who are public servants just like us, people who are in our same roles, are moving the needle in the opposite direction, are really pushing us back. And so don't lean on the fact that we work for the public as just a given that we're good. You know, it's something that we have to earn with our actions. And the other thing I want to throw out there when I talk about the accountability is that for most of us, we're still in a stage with our journey, you know, looking into equity and inclusion and whatever other concepts we put at the forefront of this, is that we don't really have checks and balances at this point. There's not someone around the corner who's going to point a finger at us if we don't get intentional and try to do our best in this area. So honestly, most of us on this call could probably go about our work as normal, and we'll be fine for our profession and our career. You know, we have to take the accountability ourselves. We need that motivation ourselves, because at this point, it's probably not going to come from an external source. There's a few exceptions. I know a few communities have moved further and they have teams that are starting to dig in to it, but for many of us, it doesn't exist yet. And so, so at this point, think about how you can motivate yourself, how you can think of what you are doing. So step one. So like I said, I hope everyone has their topic. I'll have a couple that I'll share with myself as we move forward. But with your topic, the first thing to really think about as we try to move the needle, as we try to be more equitable, is trying to define some goals. Depending on where you're at, you might have a topic that you know exactly what the problem is. You know exactly the group you want to work with, and you know how to fix it. Great. For some of you, it might be a little bit more ambiguous. You just aren't sure yet. We don't know what we don't know, which is fine. So the goal might be fact finding. It might be discovering what the problems are, and then from that, starting a new goal. Think about, if you can, within your topic, what your community is doing well and can be measured preferably, and what your community is not doing well. If your topic is too narrow and it's kind of hard to think of both the good and the bad, you can think of it broader. So I'll give a couple examples for the city of Arvada. One thing we do well is parks. We have a goal for Arvada to make every park within a 10-minute walking distance, and we have some really high, like 98, 99%. The city falls under that, which I'd say is pretty successful. And once again, measurable, walking distance, percentages. Where Arvada doesn't do well is ADA accessibility. We did a study about a year and a half, 2 years ago, and discovered that to make the entire city fully ADA compliant, that's 9 figures worth of funding. So obviously that's going to take a number of years to solve. We hired an ADA coordinator to start to tackle of that. And so once again, we can measure that by the number of projects, the dollar amount. So, we can see on the example above, yay, high five, we got it going good. And we can see the picture on the bottom of, oh no, shook my head. And we're all going to have a mixture of that. And that's natural. And it's important to recognize both the successes and the problems. So think about that for your topic, and it might be your permitting process. It might be a specific function, like how do people annex? It might be a citizen board, like the Planning Commission or Board of Adjustments, or all of that is good. So just start to think about, write down, type it, whatever works for you. Just start to list some of the things you think are going well, some of the things that aren't. So we'll go ahead and move forward, but hopefully at the end of this, you'll have a good start and can keep working on it. Part 2, and this is kind of the fun part, is to define your topic more critically. So critical thinking, critical theory is basically, in a nutshell, is you don't take anything for granted. You try to break something down into its component parts. For a brief tangent, everyone talks about critical race theory and stuff. And really what that is, it's breaking down the concept of race. How was it started? Who started it? How do we treat it? How does it impact people? That really tries to assume nothing, ask questions about everything, and tries to take that concept, in that case race, into its component parts. For example, a lot of it was started by scientists in the 1800s who one of them literally measured the inside of skulls with lead. True story, look it up. And so some of our current concepts of race and where people fall under is based on some very questionable science at the time. And so think about it for your topic. What are the rules about it? For example, for Arvada, when we talk about parks, one of our rules, one of our measurements is within a 10-minute walk. Why? Should it be 5 minutes? Should it be 15 minutes? Can we dig back and find out, does 10 minutes make sense? What are the structures to it? For, say, when we talk about ADA accessibility, some of the structures, we have multiple teams who work on it. We have public works, we have utilities, we have private owners with their own sidewalks who are involved. There's the legal aspect to ADA compliance. There's the capital improvements plans component to it. What are the policies? Who makes the decisions on this that are central to your topic? And the reason we do this, I think why we set goals is pretty self-explanatory, know where we're trying to head towards. The reason we think critically and where people get tripped up in equity a lot is that we assume that the current way we're doing things is the norm, is the best practice, is the way things have always been done. And so long as that is how we treat our current way of doing things, it's going to be very, very hard to change anything. If we can define our current processes and our current way of doing things as just one option among several, if we can get that information of why decisions were made, who made those decisions, then that takes away kind of the myth behind it. You look behind the curtain, and it's not a wizard, it's just some guy who had a similar role to us, 20, 30, 50 years ago, who made the best choice they could at the time. And there's nothing sacred to it. So as you're writing, start to brainstorm it, write these major points. But before you really try to enact the change, try to understand your topic as deeply and as intimately as you can, because that's what's going to help you navigate the questions. People say, well, why do we need to change this? Isn't it good as it is? What's the problem? And it's by breaking it down to its component parts that you can answer it. And, as the planners, you are in the best position to be able to do that. Part 3, the other thing with equity is resources. Who has resources and who doesn't? This is what this is all about. Because we know some people have advantages over others. It happens, but it needs to be part of our consideration. If we're trying to do better by our more disadvantaged residents, whether it is by race or socioeconomic status, gender, ability, so on and so forth, we need to understand resources. So you can do this in a few ways. You can do this for the public in a broader sense. You can look at this for specific groups of people, and where you can do that community outreach if you're not certain. So when we talk about resources, obviously money is there. Some processes with planning can be very expensive to go through everything, to hire the professionals you need. Some of it's a matter of time. Do people have time to attend a public meeting in the evening or in the day? And time to commit to whatever they're trying to accomplish, whether they're trying to get a shed done in their backyard, or whether it's time to really look at our rules and our codes and understand it. Expertise is a big one. The more that we know, the faster we're able to do things, the better we're able to navigate processes. Similar to relationships and politics, it helps to know people. It helps to be on good terms with people. It does, grease the wheels. And then the last one, is the lack of barriers. And what I mean by that, and it's often overlooked for resources, is the people who have some sort of obstacle, some sort of challenge that other people don't. Usually ADA stuff is the easiest to get our heads around. Obviously, if someone's in a wheelchair, a literal barrier is if we don't have a ramp into our town hall or city hall, then they literally will need someone to help pick them up to get into the front doors. If someone is blind, most websites are not friendly to that. So online processes might not even be readable. But this can happen in a lot more subtle ways too. People who have a problematic history with the city, and so people don't listen to them as much. People who are juggling, 3 jobs and all of that, end up having barriers that make even the simplest things harder. So start thinking about that for your topic. What are the resources that need to get involved? If someone wants to get annexed into the city, what resources do they need to accomplish that? If someone is filling out a permit, what resources out of those 5 and potentially other things you can think of, do they need to do it successfully? And the question is the bar set too high? In some cases, no. In some cases, yes. And the other thing with resources is consider your resources, because we're talking about how we can start to enact change within our organizations. And so we need these resources too. Maybe not money so much, but we do need time if we're going to try to create policy changes, cultural changes. We need the time to start to write that down and work on it. Expertise, that's why you're taking this training, and others. Relationships, who do you know within your organization? What are your barriers or lack thereof? So on your brainstorming sheet, really start to think about who has what. What do you have? What does your community have? Maybe even some other important people who should be included. And last one is put it all together. There are many quality toolkits out there. Garrett, I believe it's Government Alliance for Racial Equality or Equity, one of the 2's for the E, has some toolkits available free online. Bloomberg just came out with one. So there are things out there available to help you take on some more nitty-gritty steps, something that is a little bit more comprehensive and that we can't really cover in the time we have. But I do want to emphasize the main points, that before you really jump headfirst into this work, do know what your goals are. They can be very narrow. If you already have a good idea of what you want to accomplish, they might be very broad and ambiguous, and it might be research, it might be fact finding at this point, but kind of know where you're heading at this stage in the game. Be critical. If you're trying to make the difference, where we fit in as public servants is to be the experts. And so in order to do that, we need to live up to that and really dissect your issue. Become the resident expert on your issue, and then you will have the influence, you will have the means and the platform to engage in the change that you're looking for in the topic you have today, and hopefully in others as you go along, but a few things at a time. We're in a marathon, not a sprint. And then think about the resources, because that's where equity fits in. Not everyone is the same. People are different, and that's okay. We just need to consider what those are, what people have to bear, and whether that matches our services, and whether our services match what people have available. And the other thing I'll highlight is to ask for help. Oftentimes, depending on your organization, depending on where you're at, it can be a bit of a lonely process. There are times when we just have to be the one to sit down on the computer or on the whiteboard or on a notepad and just do the work ourselves. But in the long term, we shouldn't do this alone. You will burn out if you try to do this by yourself, 100% guaranteed. And, we've all had burnout before, but it's not a good long-term strategy. So ask for help. Ask for help from colleagues, both within APA and within your organizations, within your department and outside of your department. When you think about the resources, think about what you lack. Maybe you don't have access to your town or city manager, but you know who does, and you need to bring them into the fold. Ask for help as you go through these steps. It doesn't have to be a solo act. And that is what will, bring in that diversity of viewpoints in. Can be within the organization, it can be outside in the community, can be experts, can even be a neighbor or a spouse if you want to just get a layman's perspective on it. So ask for help. So we have a couple slides left, and we're actually doing really good on time. So what we might do is certainly open for questions and give you a little bit more time if you want to keep kind of working on your brainstorming document. Like I said, I know that this has not been enough time for you to write everything out. And depending, we can go back on slides if people want to copy some stuff. We'll make the recording available to people too. But I do want to hit on a couple other things. One is two arguments that do hold up very well legally. Just as before, we talked about some of the things we can't do, some of the constraints we have. Two things we do have at our disposal is economic development and the public good. These are motivations for development and other land use that has really stood strong over generations. Economic development, it tends to be nonpartisan. It is celebrated. A lot of court cases, both that have helped with equity, that have unfortunately pushed it back, and even adjacent cases not directly about it, have been upheld in the name of economic development. So you might not be able to help a impoverished area because they belong to a certain demographic group, but you have the potential to help an area because it is economically underdeveloped. Of course, you need the data and the facts to back that up. You can't just wordsmith it and just say, see, smoke and mirrors, support that claim. But that is a good resource to turn to. And the other one is the public good. I mean, it is how planning was legitimized. The Euclid case, which is how usually credited to the start of planning as a profession and, accepted in the eyes of the law, was based on doing things for the public good. So once again, it might not be for the sake of this group or that group, but there's a lot of changes, a lot of approvals, and a lot of things we can decline to in this name. But once again, do the homework, support this by evidence, and this is another good thing to follow on. And then our last slide, one last consideration, and I told you at the beginning, the spur to action is, if not you, then who? So kind of as before, when I talked about how just being public servants doesn't mean we necessarily do good. It should, we can, and most of us probably do, trying to break that narrative that, we've all been taught that, no, you're great, you're in this industry, don't worry. There's another theme that many of us get told is we have to wait. We are part of the process, we're part of the system, and we need someone else to give us that guidance first. We need our elected officials or our supervisor or our community or that best practice to come from another community first, to give us that clear example of what we can do first. The challenge with that is it might not come, or it might not come in a very timely fashion. We can't hold our breath for the next national charismatic leader to, sweep us up in a big movement, or even a local charismatic leader to do the same. The fact is that for those of us in our positions we're the technical experts. We're the ones working day in, day out at our jobs, and we can't be everything to everyone, but it's on us to take the initiative, because when it comes to reforms within planning, whether you want to look at your comprehensive plan with your land use, figure out how you can get low income or multifamily housing into your area, or whether you want to start to curb, wealthier single family urban sprawl, whatever equity topics you have in mind, I would strongly suggest that if it's not I think when we started, we had over 40 people on this. If it's not those of you who are taking your lunch break to listen to this, who have careers as planners, think about how high of a bar that's set of who else would there be instead. And I say this because it should make people feel a little bit uncomfortable. And that's the point, is that is what spurs us on. It is a compass to be like, gosh, that sounds really hard. I'm not sure I can do this. I feel that all the time for my job, but that also means I'm heading in the right direction. So with that, I do have one public announcement I was asked to make, but before that, I will stop share and open the floor to some questions or comments or clarifications. All right, let me read Aaron's out loud for everybody. What strategies have you seen be successful to balance community expectations and have more productive conversations around engagement, funding, change, etc., as you shift how you do things to hopefully achieve more equitable outcomes? That is a great question, because it is certainly a mixed bag. For every successful case, there's certainly a couple that haven't been. So a couple things I can answer to that is work on your storytelling skills. Tomato, tomato. An example that happened with Arvada, we had a selected consultant group, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion consultant in January. We're about to kick off, and it did not go well with council. They weren't interested in the group. We weren't as far along as we thought, and so we had to step back. And so what I ended up doing is having to work on the story behind this that really told people this is a normal part of it. We will face setbacks. It doesn't mean everything we do is just, now not genuine or not legitimate and we have to give up. We're going to take the lessons learned, we're going to regroup, and we're going to go back to it. And we actually just had another meeting to kind of keep moving the conversation forward last night, which went much better. So craft your story in a way that moves you forward, that really aligns with the goals you're trying to reach. And part of that, as I said, is to be critical, understand your topic, be the resident expert, and be that source for questions. And the other thing I would say for that is give people grace and meet them where they're at. People are in very different places for this kind of work. Some people have never taken a training, have never read a news article. They don't know any of the concepts. Be okay with that and be okay with them. It is not going to help to shame people. People feel naturally uneasy and guilty as it is. And just be positive, be open, be welcoming as you get started. There does come a time when you need to have those harder, more critical conversations, but especially to start with, just, guide people in softly. And that's kind of what I've heard from other communities tends to go better. I see your hand up, Karen. I'm going to read Keith's first, and then we'll get to your question. So Keith, in some communities, economic development is viewed as the Trojan horse to gentrification and displacement. Yes, I kind of alluded to that when I said economic development has been used both for equity and for not. Yes, 100%. This is a reason why gentrification gets pushed forward. It is part of our toolkit. So just as, for example, one of our constraints is we have to be very careful how we explicitly talk about race. We saw that earlier, more recent case where someone said, well, you can't, actually, so I have my cheat sheet. Yeah, the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. In that case, it used the idea of discrimination and flipped it on its head. So that's why economic development is a tool we have that we can flip it on its head. But we have to be careful. And it really is to us as the local experts to see how it is being used. So yeah, the best I can offer is that, that's where the responsibility and accountability falls on us to how do we use these terms that are very broad, that are very general in our work. So Karen.
Hello, I wanted to thank you for this presentation. Actually, I think it's very good, very well done. And I wanted to share that this work I've been in for over 20 years, from a grassroots level to internally, starting the efforts at Denver Human Services and now at Dottie as a community engagement specialist. And I can tell you that one of the big advantages of this work, if you really want to do it, is to reach out to the marginalized communities and have conversations. You alluded to the fact that, there are people who, they don't even know some of these conversations are taking place, and that's very true. So, if there are projects happening, if there are things that are going on, one of the things that you hear in these communities is that they have no power because it's government and no voice in the decisions that are being made. However, in these communities, if there's an advance notice, if there's some conversation, because yes, these are oftentimes people who are in survival mode, but you have the opportunity to speak with them. Conversations like this should have plenty of marginalized people, Black, brown, yellow. We need to be sure that they are included in these conversations. So I wanted to say that because I've seen it inside of government and on the outside with the work that I do. And I don't use the term work flippantly. It is very much work. And there is a such thing as compassion fatigue. Everybody wanted to have these conversations around the murder of George Floyd. And then I find that with that same vein, there are people who are just tired now, because there is a such thing as compassion fatigue. And so with that, the best thing to employ is self-care. When you get to that point of, and I love, Matt, how you brought up, don't try to be a solo act in this, bring in who you can work with. And some of those people are Black and brown people who would come alongside to get the work done. So let's not rule out that there's opportunity there as well. And then the last thing I want to say, as a Black woman, I feel like one of the most important things I can share, I have a lot of allies in this work who say, I don't know what to do, or I don't feel like I'm doing enough. There's some very simple and basic things that can be done to move this work forward, internally and externally. Internally, if you see a person that's showing up every day and doing their job, advocate for promotion for that person. Consider them when hiring, if you are a hiring manager in position to do so. You know their work ethic, they show up, that they do their best to perform every single day. Externally, Although redlining is illegal, a lot of the HOAs that we live under, those HOAs have inherent discrimination written into the bylaws in a lot of cases. You can challenge your HOA and you can challenge your friends and family members who choose to think a certain way, which is probably the hardest of all, but also may be the most effective. So that's just what I wanted to say. Thank you so much for the invitation. If anybody wants to reach out to me, I am happy to be a resource, because we need resources, and I'm happy to serve as a resource in this work wherever you live. And thank you very much, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. And just to piggyback on a couple of things, as I mentioned before, oftentimes the community members who are proactively coming to us aren't the ones we need to hear, because they're already coming to us. So it does put it on us to reach out to them. And the excuse that, well, they can come to the meetings or we put it on the website, that's a good start, but there is that perception that we have to prove wrong. We have to be proactive to really convince them, no, we mean it. Come to the meetings, come to do this, I'll come to you, and show them first. Because they might have had an experience where they weren't turned away. Even if it wasn't your community, it might have been their last one. So, so it does take that proactive effort. So thank you, Karen. We have one more question I have that was done directly. So the question is, how can non-planners in layman's terms look for inequities in an already written law, like zoning and codes? So for the people who aren't necessarily experts, probably my best answer to that is to think about how such laws affect them and maybe their own circle. And that's where really getting different people involved to look at something can really be valuable. Because one thing I didn't cover it, I say this for a number of webinars I give, but for me, if you haven't told, I've taken a number of like privilege tests, and I'm all of the categories on that. And there's definitely a place for me in this conversation, and it's kind of similar things I said, to try to be the resident expert, be critical, as Karen mentioned earlier, to be the one to speak up and say, hey, wait a second, I don't think that's right, when there's no one else in the room to do it. My role is not to speak for the community at all, or at least most of it. And so to answer that question about how can someone who isn't an expert in is, just get their own perspective of their own life perspective, how this directly involves them. And you don't need a degree to be able to read a law and think about how it'll affect you. So.
And if I could just jump in real quick to tag on to what Matt was saying, what is the piece of legal, whatever it is that you're reading, what does it say? What does it do? So I'll just take ADUs, for example. That this has actually hit me before, where if you don't say allow for weird alternative ADUs that are essentially like donut holes inside of a house with no exterior options, you're negating a pretty big population who actually uses that type of housing. And the question is why do we do it like that? Why don't we allow it? But what it does when you don't allow for that kind of thing is it negates a whole grouping of people who that's how they like to live intergenerationally. It negates their ability to do that. So just food for thought, something to think about. But I really appreciate what you said, Matt. What does it do to actually people? Yeah.
Great. So give a few seconds, see if there's any other questions, something anybody feels to share for the group. Erin, please.
Yeah, thank you, Matt and Jennifer. I really appreciate you guys doing this training today. I was just going to mention, I did share with Jennifer The Florida chapter of APA is going to be doing also a really in-depth multi-day training on equity, and I'll put a link in the chat. So if this really piqued your interest and you want to learn more, I think that would be a good opportunity. I believe that's next month. So it's a small cost, but nothing extensive, and I think would really build on some of what you and Jennifer talked about today. So I will put that in the chat if folks are interested.
Great. So, all right, everyone. So I know this can be a bit of a heavier topic. It can be overwhelming, but the thing I do want to impart and kind of the not so hidden meaning was, if you're looking for the answer of what you can do, you already have, the pieces there. So there's some tools you can use, there's some techniques you can use, but you really are in the best position to start moving the needle and for you to be the one who other communities turn to for that best practice. So go ahead and stop the recording and I'll hang around for a few more minutes. Otherwise, yeah, thank you all so much for taking the time.